Now, Ruth is a very special person because she was the lady who brought the whole thing in the first place, working directly with Gordon Brown. She was Treasury Minister who led the whole thing. And, for example, the team from NatWest, who are very kindly sponsoring us today, actually recall being in the same meeting as I do with Ruth when she was introducing the whole scheme in 2004. So that gives it a bit of perspective. That's 20 years. This is a long-term scheme. So Ruth went on to be Minister of Education, Secretary of State for Education, and all sorts of other important government roles before moving into the non-political field. But I will leave her to carry on from there. Ruth, do come up, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Gavin, and it's been a pleasure working with you as a trustee on the Share Foundation for countless years. I think it's 14 probably, which coincides with the time when I left Parliament. And Gavin has done so much in this area to take forward these ideas and make sure that not only do people know about the Child Trust Fund, they're reunited with their funds, and that the most deprived cohorts of kids today, those in care, are being helped through similar means. So thank you very much, Gavin, for that. I must say my job at the Treasury as Economic Secretary to the Treasury was probably the most fun and the one I enjoyed most in government. That says something about what it's like as soon as you put your head above the parapet and people realise you exist in the media. But it was great in those days, and I had the opportunity to do lots of really interesting things, one of which was to encourage savings and investment in the private sector. So Gavin asked me here today to tell you a little bit about the genesis of the Child Trust Fund, which was, as he said, introduced in the early 2000s, and the philosophy which underpinned that policy. The idea was always an ambitious one. Tony Blair, who was Prime Minister at the time, described the introduction of the funds in 2003 as, and I quote him, a big progressive idea with far-reaching consequences for extending opportunity in Britain. It flows from our belief that the duty of government is not just to attack entrenched privileges that hold people back, but to vigorously promote equality in life chances. It is a decisive moment in our second-term mission to create a society that is open, genuinely based on merit and the equal worth of all. So some people trace the origin of the thinking behind child trust funds right back to Thomas Paine, who in 1797 proposed a national fund to pay £15 to every 21-year-old in England. Others to James Mead, the Nobel Prize-winning British economist, who wrote half a century ago that an unequal distribution of property means an unequal distribution of power, even if it is prevented from becoming too unequal a distribution of income. More recently, back in the late 1990s and early 2000s, thinkers such as Will Paxton and Gavin Kelly, no relation of mine, at the Institute of Public Policy Research, started to develop what they described as a new type of asset-based welfare. While on the other side of the Atlantic, scholars in the US, such as Michael Sheridan, were beginning to argue that the poor could build significant assets with the right jump start. He also contended that assets changed people's perspectives on life. And he said, and I quote, "While incomes feed people's stomachs, assets change their heads." So it was drawing on this thinking, the IPPR developed a model in which baby bonds, as they termed them, would be given by the government to each child at birth. As a fairly new backbench MP, I was involved in lots of discussions around the topic. The salience of the thinking was significantly bolstered by work carried out by academics at UCL using the National Child Development Survey, which found that adults aged 23 in 1981 who had received at least £5,000 at the time of the survey were twice as likely to be in self-employment as those who hadn't received an inheritance, even after controlling for every other factor. Indeed, research based on the same survey suggested that holding a mere £300 to £600 had a positive impact on health, on the labour market, and on educational achievement. This insight, combined with the fact that 2/3 of all UK adults aged between 35 and 44 had less than £500 in savings or financial assets in the late 1990s, together with the rapid growth in public resources being spent on middle-class tax reliefs for asset accumulation, helped create a political appetite within the Labour government for new policy thinking on how to spread financial wealth. And it was against that intellectual backdrop that in the run-up to the 2001 election, the Labour government presented asset-based welfare as a new fourth pillar of the welfare state after work, income, public services. The Child Trust Fund initiative was then a central part of the 2001 manifesto alongside a savings gateway which matched pound for pound the savings of undersaved adults. So I was lucky enough to be made economic and financial secretary to the Treasury after the election in 2001 with responsibility, as I said, for savings policy, and I held that post for a number of years. Why was I so convinced of the merits of the policy? Well, obviously the evidence from UCL helped, but also because it tallied with my own personal instincts that we needed to open our eyes to more fundamental causes of poverty and lack of ambition. I believe that wealth or assets are in many ways even more important in determining life chances than income, as your total wealth better captures the resources that you can access at any one time. And not only that, but asset ownership or property ownership brought other important benefits to individuals, providing extra security, a financial cushion for when things go wrong, an ability to cope with large one-off costs such as a car breaking down or a child starting school. That extra security would mean that people were able to take extra risks, such as starting a new business or undertaking more education or training. So during my time in the roles of first economic and then financial secretary, when I held this part of the policy, there was a series of consultations covering questions of policy design. How much would the state transfer? At what age? Who could run these accounts? What could they charge? What happened when parents failed to open accounts? And so on. The Child Trust Fund was finally launched in the 2003 budget, with accounts going live in early 2005, although children born from September 2002 onwards were eligible. It was to be both universal, a financial contribution from the government for each child born after the 1st of September 2001, and progressive, with a greater endowment for children from poorer backgrounds. Around 700,000 babies are born in each year in Britain. For each newborn child, the government was to make an initial endowment of at least £250, rising to £500 for the poorest children, and subsequent endowments were planned for when the child turned 7, 11, and 14. The intention was that children would see their endowments grow over time, add their own contributions, or have them added to by friends and family, start to plan their future, and then be able to invest in their talents and ideas when they turned 18. We hoped that families of all income brackets would start to save for their children, committing an extra £5 or £10 a month to their child's funds. I remember describing how I hoped that children in the playground would be discussing what they would do with their wealth when they grew up, that the maths curriculum would adapt to talking about interest rates, asset classes, and investments as interest grew, that children would take on Saturday jobs to pay extra into their child trust fund. The idea was that by the age of 18, the fund would have accumulated into an asset of several £1,000s, enabling all young people to have the chances available only to some, enabling them to have the backing of a real financial asset to invest in activities such as learning, buying a home, or setting up a business. Indeed, universalism, the fact that every child had an account, and financial education were both to be critical parts of the story, although I know that Gavin thinks differently to me on that specific issue. 5 years on, when the new coalition government announced that the funds were to be axed as part of their first budget, more than 6 million accounts had already been opened, and the Child Trust Fund was replaced by the Junior ISA. Nothing on the scale of the Child Trust Fund had been tried before anywhere else in the world. I strongly believed then, and still believe now, that welfare policy can't just be seen as meeting immediate needs, but that a longer-term view needs to be taken. Behaviour needs to be changed, confidence promoted, and people's individual talents backed. But it's also probably worth spending some time considering the mechanics of the Child Trust Fund operation as we now consider ways of reuniting funds with their intended beneficiaries. There were essentially two routes by which a Child Trust Fund account could be opened, either by the responsible person, the parent, or by the Inland Revenue. So the working assumption that in the vast majority of cases, the child's parents would open the account, with the revenue having just a fallback role in the event that no account was opened. Vouchers were sent to the parents of all newborn children, and they had up to 12 months to choose and open an account for their child. If nothing was done with the voucher and the time expired, a default account would be opened on the child's behalf. Of course, the families of children who failed to open an account for their child were among the most vulnerable in the country. They had received the voucher, but they hadn't actually done anything with it. So we aimed to ensure that there was both a diversity of account providers for these accounts, that they were invested in equities given the long time frame over which they were designed to operate. And in the event, 14 providers came forward to offer defaults accounts for these children. It was the responsibility of HMRC to contact the families and let them know about the account, which I'm sure they attempted to do. I'm not so sure that there was much follow-up after that, either by HMRC or by the providers, despite the providers being able to charge up to a maximum of 1.5% of the value of the fund every year. I think the Share Foundation has also found that over 40% of all young people who are now eligible, that is, those who are over 18 and could access their accounts and draw down the money, have not yet done so. The average value of over 1 million accounts as yet unclaimed by young adults is almost £2,000, meaning that over £2 billion is waiting for the rightful owners to come forward and access their funds. So what does this teach us? So for this part of my speech, I'm thinking about how others have reflected on the policy as well as myself, particularly Gavin Kelly at the Resolution Foundation, who's done a lot of work in this area. Firstly, as we knew clearly from the start of the project, there were never going to be any early winners from the Child Trust Fund. As Gavin has written, by any standards, a near 2-decade lag from initial announcement to the creation of real beneficiaries is a long stretch. Secondly, the timing wasn't great if you're thinking about how radical new policy is best implemented in democratic systems. The funds were a product of thinking in the first term of New Labour, when New Labour was in the ascendancy and there wasn't much challenge. Government debt wasn't so much as a problem as it is today. There seemed to be room for radicalism and experimentation. Certainly, there was a belief around that pretty much anything was possible. But by the time the policy was implemented in practice, because it takes a lot of time to work up detailed proposals and have them agreed to by every department in government and pass all the relevant legislation, Labour was nearing the end of its second term in government, only a few years away from a complete change in regime. And yet the policy was never developed with the imperative to gain a cross-party consensus before its introduction. And thirdly, the policy never really had a groundswell of support or clamouring for its introduction, and nor was it in place quite long enough to develop one. Poverty campaigners who hadn't really been involved in the initial thinking behind the Child Trust Fund and had been claiming for, had been campaigning for extra income support for lower income children and families, were initially a bit sceptical about the idea, although they did, it must say, become much more enthusiastic after the policy was implemented. And then there were those in economic think tanks, such as the IFS, the Institute for Fiscal Studies, who, as I remember, argued that wealth didn't really matter because it was just an accumulation of income and a store of income, and that it's income that we should be focusing on as a society. Those points, are all fair. While Labour used the Child Trust Fund as a main plank of its campaigns in 2010, few actually decried the removal of the policy as one of the first acts of the coalition government. It was indeed one of the conditions the Liberal Democrats imposed on the coalition as a price of their support. And the country, of course, was entering at that time a period of austerity. Nevertheless, despite the austerity of the coalition and those years, the need for a policy to help build capital for the poorest in society has never been greater. I see recently that there is some renewed interest in similar types of idea. Liam Byrne, MP, Chair of the Business and Trade Select Committee, has pointed out that since 2010, the wealth of the top 1% of the population has increased 31 times the wealth of the rest. Child trust funds are one measure to spread opportunity by redistributing capital. Liam has proposed the creation of a UK sovereign wealth fund, grown over the years to around 180 billion, and from which dividends of around £10,000 are paid to every young person to help provide a deposit for a home in the form of a match savings bonus and a tax break. David Willits, I saw yesterday in the newspapers, has been arguing for a citizen's payment to every young person on coming of age of £10,000 as well. And there are lots of other ideas out there. But the message of today, and with all your help, is to support those young people who already have assets at their disposal, which they should know about, which are theirs, that they should be able to access, to use as a financial cushion, to access education, to put down as a deposit on a house or to buy a car, to help start a new business, that those young people, particularly the most vulnerable in society, are able to claim what is theirs. So thank you very much, everyone, for coming here today, and I hope you enjoy the sessions very much. Thank you.
Thanks, Ruth. That was absolutely fantastic. While you're just thinking about the questions or any comments you want to make to Ruth, who will come up and answer them, just to let you know, I will be comparing in the first half until the break, and then for the second half, Lisa Campbell. Where is Lisa? Is she around somewhere? Yeah, she's over there. She'll be comparing for the second half. So just to let you know who's who, Lisa runs Investor Conferences Limited. So thank you, Lisa. Right, Ruth, please come on up. Now, does anyone have any questions? And then Ferdy will come around with a microphone so that you can ask, or any comments. Do I see any hands in the air? Any thoughts?
You could ask me a question, Gavin.
I could, yes. I think the question that I would ask is the one about how in a democratic government with a time cycle of 5 years, it's possible to cope with any structure which lasts for 20 years. Because actually, it's a fundamental problem of democracy, isn't it? And how do we deal with that? Do we bring in a Royal Commission? I'll talk about that later.
Yeah, it's a really, really interesting question. Of course, Royal Commissions are tried on things, and they don't always succeed either. I know that I was Secretary of State for Transport in 2008, and my successor was Andrew Adonis, who tried to bring in the HS2 rail line with huge cross-party. It worked really, really hard on developing a cross-party consensus for a long-term investment programme. And even that, manages to get at least partially dismantled with time and change of priorities and so forth. Personally, I think now it was probably too ambitious a policy. It is extremely difficult to get long-term buy-in from political parties with all sorts of different agendas. Actually, the Conservatives supported the introduction of the Child Trust Fund at the time. It was the Liberal Democrats who were most hostile or sceptical about the introduction. Little did we know there was going to be a coalition government where the Liberal Democrats would have a commanding hand at the time of the following election. So it's just an inherent weakness of democracy, although, of course, there are more strengths than weaknesses.
Yeah, the thing is that I will raise this in my last talk, but unfortunately Ruth will have left by then, so I need to ask her the question now, which is, if you were in government now, would you contemplate hypothecating inheritance tax, which is about £7 billion a year, so that it went to benefit disadvantaged young people and was focused and actually ring-fenced like that in the same way as the BBC license fee pays for the BBC?
Very sadly, Gavin, I'm going to have to disagree with you a bit on this one as well. I mean, I think there is an argument, obviously, for inheritance to be taxed. There are always different priorities in government, and it would suffer from exactly the same fate, I think, as every other initiative that is designed to promote long-term change in society, in that different political parties would have different views. But personally, I also think that we should concentrate more on enabling than penalising. And I think people would see that as penalising people who had done well in order to enable. And the beauty of the Child Trust Fund, in my view, was that it was all about levelling up from the bottom up, to coin a phrase, rather than, as it were, equalising down. So again, it's just a different strategy to get, similar results.
Comments, questions? Anyone got any thoughts?
Along the same theme, how do you think we can develop policies with cross-party support? Because it's a great initiative, but it then becomes a political football. And I wonder if there was anything you would have done differently now to perhaps garner greater cross-party support. Because otherwise it will never work.
Yeah, I mean, there are some things. So Gavin and I said I didn't agree with him on this because the sort of ideal solution is for this, in my view, to be universal. Maybe it would have been much less controversial had it been targeted on the cohort of young people that were disadvantaged, for instance. There are all sorts of things you can do to try and buy political support. But as I said, leaderships change and philosophies change within parties, and the Conservative and the Labour Party were unanimous in supporting the policy when it was introduced. So could we have changed the attitude of the Lib Dems? I don't know. Maybe if there'd been a commission on wealth and this had been the prime outcome, maybe it could have entered manifestos in a different way. But it's just a really tall order.
Any other thoughts?
Thanks. Thanks, Ruth. It's great to hear about the history of this. I suppose if you'd had your time again and looked at both the design of the Child Trust Fund as a product, and then also given the three objectives of Child Trust Funds and sort of what more could have been done to make sure that all three, rather than just the investment one, was achieved. Is there anything that you would have done differently?
I think I would have loved to see more emphasis on financial education to change people's mindsets. I think that is something, I've just been talking to teachers of financial education, but I think the great thing about the Child Trust Fund is people had it, and it was theirs, and in time they would have come to understand that they needed to think about how it worked, what interest was, why it was building up over time, or why it had dipped from 1 month to another, and so forth. So I had always envisaged that financial education would have been a quite significant part of the development of the policy, but it was never in existence long enough to develop that.
Any other final thoughts?
Ruth, thank you firstly for backing the Child Trust Fund and getting it off the ground all those years ago. My question is, with the potential for a change of government later this year and potentially Labour coming back into power, what do you think will be the stance of a Labour government towards this legacy project? And do you think we will see more support from them towards trying to reconcile these accounts with young people?
I would very much like to think so. Gavin and I have talked about this as, another sort of post office type scandal. All of these accounts are out there. They belong to people, and yet, in a way, it's not benign neglect. This is serious neglect taking place by the authorities, in my view. It will be easier for a Labour government because Labour was behind the policy in the first place. It was their policy. Whereas it's always bound to be a bit difficult for a government that was part of the regime that scrapped it. So I would like to think, although I don't know, that it would be much easier to work with if there's a change of regime.